Good morning. My name is Geoff Mead. I'm calling from Gloucestershire in the west of England, and I'm very happy to be here. And thank you, Artem, for inviting me to take part in your event. So my subject this morning is what I call narrative leadership, which is a little bit different from simply telling stories, although of course it does involve storytelling. I'd like to begin by moving the slide, if I can find how to do that. Yes, we have. Good. So this is a picture of a place called Bramshill in Hampshire in England. And from 1988 to 1991, I worked there as the director of the National UK Police High Flyers Programme, which is when I first began to think about leadership and what it meant. And I had the great good fortune to work with very many fine young men and women who are now leading the police services in this country and abroad. And I suppose it's fair to say that I learned a great deal, probably more from them than I was able to teach them back. And I suppose the most important thing I learned was that you can't separate the person from the role. A leader is someone who's leading, and it requires their whole self to do it. It's not simply something they do for a job. You could call it life work, if you like. People who work in leadership roles devote a huge amount of time, energy, and effort to the work, and it is their life. And of course, every person is different, and the way that every person leads is different. So since then, which is 30 years ago, I've been working in the field that is called leadership development. But I discovered over the years that I'm much more interested in leading as a verb than leadership as a noun. Because if it's leading, the verb is something we can do. And if it's leadership the noun, it's something we either have or we don't. So I discovered over the years that there are three really important questions that all of us ask ourselves in our lives, and it's particularly important that leaders ask those questions. And these are the three questions. So the first is about identity and values. Who am I? Where do I come from? And what do I really care about? And I make that, it's easy to say what we think we care about, but actually digging down to find out what it is that really matters to our lives and understanding that is critical to a good life and to be able to lead well. The second question is, where do I belong? In which community do I place myself? And is it small? Is it my family? Is it my village, my community, my town? Is it my country? Is it humanity? Is it bigger than that? And the third question is, what do I serve? What do I want to put my life energy into? What difference do I want to make? Okay. So you might call these values and identity, your place in the world, and the purpose and the causes that you support and that you try and achieve. And the reason that this is important for narrative leadership is that the answer to all these three questions is found in stories, the stories that we tell ourselves, the stories that we listen to, and the stories through which we see the world. So let me look at the first of these. Who am I? What's my identity? So I'm going to make some propositions here which are the basis of the work that I do and I believe to be true. And the first of them is that the very question of who we are is a collection of stories. Our sense of who we are, our identity, is comprised of the stories that we tell ourselves and the stories that others tell us. We can see this in counseling and therapy, for example, where we're looking at if our story becomes stuck or dysfunctional, how do we address that? And what stories do we pay attention to? So if we want to discover what we really care about, we need to explore our own stories. And from that, we can connect with what gives us joy and life and energy. And what's so helpful is that these stories are not fixed or stuck. We can look for new stories and we can look to pay attention to different stories. So if we're thinking about change and development, then we have to get below the surface as to of what we look like and what we do to who we are. And stories are a very powerful route for that. The second realm in which stories are crucial are the social realm, connection, community. So one of the ways we create community or organization is to share our stories and to believe that we are part of a shared story. We can see on the political stage, the geopolitical stage, that when people in a community stop listening to each other's stories, trouble ensues. And that one of the fundamental ways of healing fractures in society is to speak our stories and have them listened to. A well-known example of this is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that Nelson Mandela set up in South Africa. And there have been about 30 national Truth and Reconciliation or Peace and Reconciliation Commissions since then worldwide. In organizational terms, it's about who we listen to. And do we hold open questions about how we are together? If we don't do that, I argue that we can't change. We can't change our systems, our procedures, our organizations. And we end up going round and round in circles, rather like this Escher picture. This may well remind you of organizational reorganizations that you've been through. It certainly reminds me of many that I've been involved in. And thinking more widely still, from the individual to the group to the way in which we see the world, big stories through which we make sense of being in the world and what we think is significant. We see this, for example, a very powerful issue at the moment is that of climate change. What's the story that we attend to in relation to the planet? For some people, this is the most significant story of our time. For other people, it's simply not true. And those stories determine people's stance and actions in the world. In a similar way, we, as leaders, need to think about what's our organization for, and can we change that story so that it fits the significant environmental issues, the strategic issues around us. And if we can't change the story, then we die. This is an image from Easter Island, and that society couldn't change its story. And they went on making stone gods and deforesting the island to the point that it was uninhabitable. So to pull these things together and focus it around narrative leadership, I argue that we've come to the heart of it, the matter, that our ability to change ourselves, our organizations, and our world depends on our capacity to reimagine them. Nothing changes unless the stories change. So if we share this understanding of why story is significant for the person, the group, and the wider world, then it makes sense of the model that I use for narrative leadership. I use a logo, an image of a tree as the symbol of my company to illustrate that narrative leadership, using story purposefully and authentically and ethically for leading, is far more complex and it's more than simply telling a good story. Narrative leadership has roots and branches and a trunk, just like a tree. If we look at the roots first, then this is where we look at our own stories, knowing one's own life story without being a prisoner of it, getting a perspective on who we are and what we really care about. And the branches represent building of relationships and communities through a flow of stories. And this is as much about listening to other people's stories as it is about telling your own. And the trunk of the tree is about standing for something. What is it you stand for? And at that point, when you've drawn down from the roots to be clear what you care about, and you've listened through the branches to what is needed in the world, you're in a position to find authentic and compelling stories that represent what you stand for, what you care for, and the difference you want to make. So narrative leaders come in all shapes and sizes. But one thing they have in common is that when they tell their story, you know it represents the heart of who they are and what they believe and what they want for the world. Steve Jobs, think of him at the product launch of Apple, a great storyteller. Martin Luther King in 1963 at Washington, D.C., I Had a Dream. It's one of the great pieces of public storytelling of the 20th century. And sometimes narrative leaders look like this. Greta Thunberg, a young girl, speaking truth to power at the United Nations. telling what she believes to be the most important story for her generation. So that's the framework within which I work. That is narrative leadership. It's all those three things. It's not simply being able to stand up and tell a story, because without the other two things, it's simply spin or anecdote. But of course, it does also include telling a good story. So if I turn now to the leader as storyteller, hang on, here we are. So there are really three things to think about. This is about the trunk. This is about being able to tell a compelling story. The first question is, where do I get stories from? And do I want to tell a story at all? When is the right time to tell a story? The simplest answer I know to that is you tell a story when you want to make something real, when you want to touch their hearts as well as their minds. In my book, Telling a Story, I give many examples of opportunities to tell stories. The second part is when you have decided you do want to tell a story, how do you put it together? How do you compose it? And having put your story together, how do you tell it in the most compelling and impactful way? How do you engage people? Again, in my book, I look at all these three elements. And in brief, repertoire is about research. You go looking for stories. It's hard work. And telling the story, understanding how to, if you like, perform it, how to tell it with impact, is an art form. It requires practice and rehearsal. And if you have time, you can consciously step back and prepare your story. You can compose it. And we can learn from the art of traditional storytelling how to do this. Yeah. I was so intrigued by this that in 2002, I took a sabbatical and went on a 3-month full-time training as a performing storyteller. So I'm going to look a little more detail at the composition part of this praxis. It's very helpful to know what elements we need to bring together to make a story work. And we can systematically take a story and make sure we have all these elements in place. The first thing we need is characters. People we care enough about to be interested in their fate. The second is action. Something has to happen in a story. We're interested in struggle and change. Stories that have impact are about people we care about striving for something worthwhile, meeting challenges and overcoming them, or sometimes being beaten by them. A good story has a clear structure, and everybody knows that a story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. But not everybody knows that it was Aristotle, the Greek philosopher, who came up with this. So the purpose of the beginning is to capture your audience's attention and to give enough information for them to begin to engage with the characters. The middle is where the drama happens, where our characters are struggling and striving to obtain these worthwhile ends. And the end of the story is the satisfying resolution, which might be hopeful, it might be tragic, but it has a sense of inevitability about it. A story is brought alive by the specific detail, the texture. That's by creating the world of the story as well as telling us what happens. When you're telling a story, use simple language, because unlike a written story where people can go back and look again, you have to take people with you word by word, sentence by sentence. And if they're trying to understand what you've just said, you've lost their attention. And the last element is emotion. We want a journey. We want to see our heroes and heroines suffer, and we want to see them struggle, and we want to see them rejoice. And I thought I might illustrate that with a story. I won't tell the whole story, but a story that you'll probably all know very well. And it's this. Oops, hang on. Okay, I can do it without, but I'm trying to move the slide on, but it's not working. The story is The Firebird. You'll all know that story, I'm sure. So think about it in terms of characters. We have the hunter, the brave hunter, we might call him Ivan, out one day in the forest, riding his horse. He has nothing in the world except ambition and hope. And he stumbles across a feather from the Firebird. And he has an idea. He says, if I take this to the Tsar, perhaps I can become rich and famous and even have lands and a good marriage. And his horse, who is a horse of power, speaks and says, are you sure you want to do that? That way lies trouble. And young Ivan says, what have I got to lose? Now, the whole story takes about half an hour to tell, so I'm not going to do that now. But you get the idea. We have a character, not just a hunter, but a young man who cares for something. We're interested. It will be. We start to become interested in his fate. He's yearning for something. Something happens, and the story begins. There is struggle and change in the story, and the Tsar sets him increasingly difficult tasks at peril of his life. So we're into the struggle, the change, the drama. Will he manage? Won't he manage? Will he get help? How will it work out? And we follow his delight every time he manages a task and his despair every time he thinks it's impossible. And a good storyteller will entrance you with detail. You know, can you imagine the firebird wheeling around overhead in the early morning light, and the whole of creation holding its breath? And so eventually, as you know in the story, Ivan manages to bring Princess Vasilisa to the Tsar's court, and she says, "I won't marry you, Tsar, unless you boil this young man alive." And his horse says, "This is it. This is the biggest trouble. This is the deeper trouble. There's nothing you can do except jump in the pot." So weeping and wailing, the young man throws himself into the pot of boiling water and emerges even more handsome than he was before. And the Tsar, the old Tsar, says, "That looks good. I think I'll do that." And he jumps in the pot. And of course, he's boiled to death. Ivan and Vasilisa are married and rule the land. And their first act is to set the firebird free. So you can take any story that is really affecting and look at these elements. And you can create and construct the story. And then through practice, through rehearsal, through feedback from friends, you can learn to tell it in a way that really connects with people. So those are the two areas I really wanted to talk about this morning. The broad picture of what narrative leadership is and why it's more than about telling a good story. And it's about telling a story well. And the best place to learn that is to look at the ancient art of the storyteller. I think we've come to the end of the time we have today, and we've managed to cover both those areas in the way I wanted to. What I haven't managed to do is, because takes a little longer translation, is to leave enough time for questions. But I'd be very happy through Artem, through the organizers, to take questions later online through email, for example, and respond if that will be helpful. And I would ask you to forgive me for my poor time management. Thank you very much. I must finish now. Goodbye.